The silence of the high country was a language Royce Barrett had learned to speak. It was a language of wind sighing through the pines, the distant crack of a falling branch, the soft pad of his own worn moccasins on a bed of needles. For 3 years, since the fever had taken Sarah and the children, silence had been his only companion, his penance and his sanctuary. It had hollowed him out, leaving a man who was more shape than substance, a ghost who still chopped wood and hunted game. His cabin, nestled in a fold of the mountains where the world couldn't easily find it, was a tomb built for one. Sarah's rocking chair still sat by the cold hearth, a silent accusation. The small wooden soldiers he'd carved for Samuel were lined up on the mantelpiece, their painted smiles a mockery of the joy they once represented. Little Mary's rag doll lay on the small cot in the corner, its button eyes staring at nothing. He lived with these ghosts every day, tending to them with a quiet, desperate grief. He kept the cabin clean, the tools oiled, the firewood stacked, performing the motions of life without any of its warmth. Living had become a habit, nothing more. This morning, like 1,000 others, he was hunting. The Winchester rifle felt like a part of his own arm, a cold, heavy extension of his will. He needed meat. Winter was a patient predator, and it was already whispering its intentions on the crisp autumn air. He moved with an economy of motion that came from years spent in the wild, his eyes scanning the dense undergrowth, his ears attuned to the faintest rustle. He was tracking a buck, a fine one from the signs, and his focus was absolute. It had to be. In this world, a moment of distraction was the difference between a full belly and a lean week. He was crouched behind a granite outcropping, the cold stone seeping into his buckskin trousers. When the sound came, it wasn't a sound of the forest. It was human. A scream, high and thin and sharp with terror, ripped through the fabric of the silence. It echoed off the canyon walls, amplified and distorted, a raw cry of a creature in its final, desperate moments. Royce froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. Human. That meant trouble. It meant complications. It meant a world he had deliberately, painfully, cut himself off from. His first instinct, honed by 3 years of isolation, was to ignore it. It was not his concern. The wild was filled with death. It was the natural order of things. He had his own ghosts to wrestle. He had no room for anyone else's. He told himself to stay put, to let the forest reclaim its silence. To finish his hunt, he gripped the smooth wood of his rifle stock, his knuckles white. But the man he had been before the fever, the man who had loved Sarah and bounced Mary on his knee, was not entirely dead. That man heard the scream not as an intrusion, but as a plea. Another scream followed, shorter this time, choked off into a terrifying gurgle. A curse, low and bitter, escaped his lips. He just couldn't sit there and do nothing. It wasn't in him, no matter how much he wished it were. The buck was forgotten. Survival could wait. With a grunt of resignation that was more a sound of pain than effort, Royce pushed himself to his feet and began to run, his long legs eating up the uneven ground, weaving through the thick stands of aspen and pine. He ran toward the sound, toward the trouble, toward the world he had tried so hard to leave behind. The sounds grew louder as he neared the edge of a narrow, rocky ravine. He could hear snarling now, a chorus of guttural growls that spoke of a fresh kill and the frenzied hunger of the pack. He slowed his pace, his hunter's instincts taking over. He crept to the edge of the ravine and peered down. The scene below sent a jolt of ice through his veins. A girl, no, a young woman was backed against a sheer rock face. She was native, her deerskin dress torn and stained, her long black hair a wild storm around her face. She held a broken branch in one hand, swinging it with a desperate, failing strength. Surrounding her were 5 gray wolves, lean and hungry, their ribs showing beneath their mangy coats. They were circling, lunging, their yellow eyes fixed on her. One had already torn a piece from her dress, and a dark stain was spreading down her leg. Another fainted, and as she turned to fend it off, a third lunged, its jaws snapping shut on her forearm. She cried out, a sound of pure agony, and stabbed at the wolf's eye with the sharp end of her branch. The animal yelped and fell back, but the others pressed in closer, sensing her weakening resolve. They were a patient, merciless tide of teeth and claws. She was going to die, right here, in this forgotten place. Royce didn't think. He acted. He raised the Winchester to his shoulder, the familiar weight a comfort. He sighted on the largest wolf, the one that seemed to be the leader. As it gathered itself for another lunge, he took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The report of the rifle was a deafening crack that shattered the canyon's air. The lead wolf was thrown sideways, a patch of fur and blood erupting from its side. It hit the ground and didn't move. The other wolves, startled by the sudden thunder, scattered for a moment, looking wildly for the source of the attack. That was the only opening he needed. Royce worked the rifle's lever, chambering a new round as he half ran, half slid down the steep, scree-covered side of the ravine. He landed hard at the bottom, his boots skidding on the loose rock. Another wolf, bolder than the rest, turned back, its lips peeled back in a snarl. Royce fired again without fully aiming, the bullet kicking up dirt just in front of the beast. It yelped and retreated. He didn't have time to reload again. 2 wolves were still between him and the girl. He dropped the rifle and drew the heavy hunting knife from the sheath on his belt. "Get back!" he roared, his voice raw from disuse. The wolves hesitated. They were not used to prey that fought back with such fury, with such noise. He charged forward, a wild man with a beard caked in trail dust and eyes that burned with a cold fire. One of the wolves lunged for him. He met it not with fear, but with a cold, calculated rage. He sidestepped, bringing the knife up in a brutal arc that sliced deep into the animal's neck. It collapsed with a choked whimper, its lifeblood staining the dusty ground. The last 2 wolves, their pack broken and their courage gone, turned and fled, melting back into the shadows of the forest from which they came. And then there was silence again. But it was a different kind of silence. It was heavy, ringing, filled with the smell of gunpowder and blood and the ragged sound of 2 people breathing. Royce stood there, chest heaving, the bloody knife still in his hand. He slowly turned to the girl. She had slumped against the rock wall, the broken branch fallen from her grasp. Her dark eyes, wide and luminous, were fixed on him. They were not just eyes filled with terror or relief. There was something else in them, a deep, knowing intelligence that seemed to pierce right through the layers of callus he had built around his heart. She looked at him, and he felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in 3 years. He saw the gash on her arm, bleeding freely now, and the deep puncture wounds on her calf. She was hurt, badly. He sheathed his knife and walked toward her cautiously, his hands held up to show he meant no further harm. "It's all right," he said, his voice softer now. "They're gone." She flinched as he got closer, her body tensing. She was a wild thing, cornered and wounded. He stopped a few feet away, giving her space. "You're bleeding. I have a cabin. Not far. I can help." She said nothing, only watched him, her gaze unwavering. He could see the debate raging within her, the fear of the strange, bearded white man against the immediate, pressing reality of her injuries. Her life was draining out onto the rocks. Finally, with a barely perceptible nod. She seemed to make a decision. She tried to push herself off the wall, but her leg gave way, and she cried out, crumpling to the ground, without another word. Royce closed the distance. He knelt, gently taking her arm to inspect the wound. The flesh was torn, but the bone seemed intact. "This needs to be cleaned," he said, more to himself than to her. He looked at her leg. It was worse. The teeth had gone deep. She would not be able to walk. He met her gaze again. I'm going to have to carry you. She stared at him for a long moment, then gave another small nod. Trusting him was a gamble, but dying here was a certainty. Royce holstered his knife securely, retrieved his rifle, and slung it over his back. He turned back to her and, as gently as he could, slid one arm under her knees and the other around her back. He lifted. She was lighter than he expected, but her body was tense, rigid with pain and fear. He started the slow, arduous climb out of the ravine, his muscles straining with the effort. As he carried her back through the forest, a strange thing happened. Her initial rigidity began to fade, replaced by the limp weight of exhaustion and pain. Her head, which she had held stiffly away from him, lolled against his chest. He could feel the frantic, weakened beat of her heart against his ribs. A dark, wet patch began to spread across the front of his buckskin shirt. Her blood, it was warm, and it soaked through the leather, seeping into the cloth of his undershirt, touching his skin. The sensation was a shock, like a pail of cold water to the face. It had been so long since he had felt the warmth of another person, so long since he had been this close to anyone. The simple physical act of carrying her, of feeling her lifeblood soak into his clothes, was a profound and deeply unsettling intimacy. He thought of Sarah, how he'd held her as the fever finally took her, how her body had felt so light in his arms at the end. He thought of Samuel and Mary, their small, warm bodies that he could no longer hold. The memories, which he usually kept locked away in a dark, quiet room in his mind, came rushing back, sharp and agonizing. But this was different. The woman in his arms was not dead. She was alive, breathing, her heart beating against his. Her blood on his shirt was not a sign of an end, but of a life he had just saved. In saving her, he had become responsible for her, and that responsibility, that connection to another living soul, was a weight far heavier than her body in his arms. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in 3 years. It was terrifying. It was painful. And as he walked through the silent trees, carrying a stranger to the home where his family had died, Royce Barrett realized, with a dawning sense of dread and wonder, that it was the first thing that had made him feel truly alive since he had buried his whole world. Something he thought had been dead and buried deep inside him had just been touched. A forgotten door had been nudged open, and he didn't know if he had the strength to close it again. The heavy oak door of the cabin groaned in protest as Royce pushed it open with his shoulder. It was a sound of violation. For 3 years, that door had opened only for him, for his grief, and for the ghosts he kept inside. Now, he was bringing the world in with him, a world of blood and pain and complication, all of it wrapped in the form of the woman in his arms. He carried her inside and paused, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior. The cabin smelled of pine smoke, old leather, and a deep, settled loneliness. To Royce, it was the smell of home, of his self-imposed prison. He wondered what it smelled like to her. The ghosts were here, watching. He could feel them. Sarah, in a rocking chair, her phantom hands still on the worn arms. Samuel and Mary, their laughter a silent echo in the rafters. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken accusations. "What are you doing?" "Royce, who is this? Why are you letting her bleed on our floor?" He ignored them. He had to. He carried the woman to the spare cot in the corner, a simple frame with a straw-ticked mattress he used for storing supplies. He laid her down as gently as he could, but a hiss of pain escaped her lips as her injured leg brushed against the frame. Her eyes, which had been closed, snapped open, locking onto his. They were dark, fierce, and held no trace of pleading, only a raw, stubborn will to survive. "Stay," he grunted, the word feeling foreign and harsh on his tongue. He turned away from her intense gaze, needing to put space between them, needing to focus on the task, not the person. He moved with a grim efficiency, the familiar rhythm of chores, a welcome anchor in the sudden storm of her presence. He stoked the embers in the hearth until a small flame licked at the fresh kindling. then set a kettle of water to boil. From a locked chest at the foot of his bed, Sarah's medical chest, he pulled out what he needed: clean linen rags she had torn years ago, a bottle of dark brown carbolic acid that stung the nostrils, a curved needle, and a spool of gut thread. Each item was a memory, a small, sharp stab of the life he had lost. This was the same chest he had opened when Samuel had cut his hand on the axe, the same rags he had used to cool Mary's feverish brow. Now he was using them for a stranger. It felt like a betrayal. When the water was hot, he poured some into a basin and carried it to the cot. He knelt beside her, the floorboards creaking under his weight. "This will sting," he warned, his voice low. She said nothing, her jaw set. Her eyes followed his every movement as he took a rag, dipped it in the hot, carbolic-laced water, and gently began to clean the ragged tear on her forearm. She flinched, a tremor running through her whole body, but she made no sound. Her breathing hitched, but it did not break. He worked carefully, his large, calloused hands surprisingly steady as he washed away the dirt and blood, revealing the mangled flesh beneath. The wolf's teeth had torn deep. He had seen worse. He had stitched up men after bar fights and tended to his own injuries from falls and mishaps in the mountains. But this was different. The cool, detached part of his mind that usually took over in these situations was absent. All he could feel was the warmth of her skin under his fingers, see the pulse beating in her wrist, and feel the searing intensity of her gaze. It was unnerving. She watched him not as a patient watches a doctor, but as a hawk watches a man, trying to understand his nature, his intent, his very soul. "What is your name?" he asked, the question abrupt. He needed to break the silence, to make her something other than this watchful, silent presence. Her lips, chapped and pale, parted. "Kaya," she whispered, the name a soft breath of sound. "Kaya," he repeated. The name felt strange in his quiet cabin. It was a living name, a name that did not belong among the ghosts. He finished cleaning the arm and moved to her leg. It was worse, just as he'd feared. The puncture wounds were deep and already beginning to swell. Infection was the real enemy now, a far more patient killer than any wolf. He cleaned the wounds with the same methodical care, his touch firm but gentle. Through it all, she remained silent, her stillness a thing of incredible strength. He had seen grown men scream and curse for less. "Apache?" he asked, glancing at the intricate beadwork on the hem of her torn dress. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Yes, Apache." Her voice was stronger this time. Her English was broken, hesitant, but clear enough. That surprised him. He threaded the needle with a piece of gut. "I have to stitch this," he said, holding it up for her to see. "The big one, on your arm." She looked from the needle to his eyes, and for the first time a flicker of something not fear, but a deep, weary vulnerability crossed her face. She nodded again. He saw her brace herself, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. As he pushed the needle through her skin for the first time, her whole body went rigid. A sharp, ragged breath was torn from her lungs. He paused, looking at her face. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her teeth gritted, but she did not pull away. He worked as quickly as he could, pulling the edges of the wound together with neat, tight stitches, just as Sarah had taught him. He was aware of every breath she took, every subtle shift of her body. The air was thick with her pain, and he felt a strange, unwelcome echo of it in his own chest. He was tying off the last stitch when she spoke again, her voice a low murmur. "You, good man." Royce froze, his hands hovering over her arm. He didn't look at her. "I'm not a good man," he said, his voice flat and empty. "I'm just a man." He tied the knot with a vicious tug, then began to bandage the wound with a strip of clean linen. "No," she insisted quietly. "You fight, for me, wolves." He said nothing, focusing on wrapping the bandage. keeping it snug but not too tight. He finished and moved to her leg, applying a poultice of herbs he kept for drawing out poison and wrapping it tightly. The entire time, he could feel her eyes on him. He felt stripped bare, as if the buckskin shirt and the years of solitude were no protection at all. She saw the tremor in his hands that he tried so hard to hide. She saw the profound weariness in his shoulders. She saw the ghosts that stood behind him. He felt a deep, primal anxiety stirring within him. It was not the fear of a lone man facing a wounded Apache woman in his cabin. It was a much deeper, more terrifying fear. It was the fear of being known. For 3 years, he had been a shadow, a memory. His interactions were limited to the silent transactions with the trapper who brought him supplies twice a year. He spoke more to his memories than to any living person. But Kaya looked at him and didn't see a ghost. She saw a man, and that was a burden he wasn't sure he could bear. When he was finished, he stood up abruptly. "Done," he said. He gathered the basin of bloody water and the soiled rags, turning his back on her. He needed to put his walls back up, and fast. He disposed of the water outside, then came back in and began to busy himself. He added more wood to the fire, the crackle and pop a welcome noise. He cleaned his rifle, the familiar, mechanical motions a comfort. He took a slab of dried venison from the stores and began slicing it into a pot, adding water and some wild onions for a thin broth. He did all of this without looking at her, pointedly ignoring her presence on the cot. He was trying to shrink the world back down to its proper size, the 4 walls of his cabin, with only him inside. But it was no use. He could feel her. He could feel her watching him move, her gaze a physical weight on his back. Survival had bound them together in that ravine, a raw and bloody knot. But now, in the quiet of the cabin, something else was taking its place. It wasn't gratitude, and it wasn't fear. It was a current of connection, a silent acknowledgement of shared life in a place defined by death. He was trying to sever that connection, to pretend it didn't exist. But Kaya, with her silent, knowing eyes, refused to let him. He ladled some of the hot broth into a wooden bowl and carried it over to her. He held it out. "Eat," he commanded, his tone gruff. She looked at the bowl, then back at his face. Slowly, she reached out with her good arm and took it. Her fingers brushed against his, and the contact, brief as it was, sent another jolt through him. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. She held the bowl in her lap and looked at him. "Thank you," she said. Her English was simple, but her tone was not. It was filled with a dignity that turned his simple act of duty into something more, something he didn't want. He retreated to the other side of the cabin, taking a seat on a stool by the fire. His back to her, he stared into the flames, trying to lose himself in their dance. He wanted the silence back, the empty, peaceful silence he knew. But the new silence was different. It was filled with the soft sounds of her sipping the broth, the rustle of the straw mattress as she shifted her weight. It was a living silence, and it was unbearable. He felt like a cornered animal himself. He had built this fortress of solitude brick by painful brick, and in a single afternoon, this woman had breached its walls without even trying. She was a splinter lodged deep under his skin. The immediate danger was past, but her presence was a constant, throbbing ache. It was a reminder of a world of feeling, of connection, of life, and he had no place for that here. This cabin was a place for endings, not beginnings. He heard the soft clink of the wooden bowl being set on the floor. He didn't turn around. He just sat there, gripping his knees, a stranger in his own home. He was trying his best to keep his distance, to remain the ghost he had become, but he had a sinking feeling, a terrifying certainty deep in his gut, that Kaya wasn't going to let him. She had seen the man beneath the grief, and Royce was afraid she wouldn't stop looking until she had pulled him all the way out. Night fell like a final curtain, swallowing the mountains and pressing in on the small, flickering light of the cabin. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, A lonely, mournful sound. Inside, the silence was a living thing, a third presence in the room. Royce sat by the fire, oiling the action of his Winchester for the third time. It was a pointless, repetitive task, a way to occupy his hands and keep his gaze fixed on something other than the woman on the cot. He had given her the last of the broth, and a cup of water. He had checked her bandages. He had done his duty. Now, he wanted her to sleep. He wanted the cabin to return to its proper state of emptiness. Even if she was still in it, he needed her to become an object, a piece of furniture, so he could forget she was a person. But she would not sleep. He could feel her awake, could feel her eyes on him in the dim, dancing light. Every time a log shifted in the hearth, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, he could sense her tense. Every gust of wind that rattled the window shutter made her breath catch. The wolves had left their mark on her, not just on her flesh, but on her mind. He kept his back to her, a solid wall of buckskin and denial. He told himself her fear was not his problem. He had saved her. He had tended her wounds. He had fed her. He owed her nothing more. Come morning, he would decide what to do with her. Until then, she was just there, an interruption. The woman. Kaya's voice was quiet, but it cut through the cabin's silence like a knife. The one who lived here. She made this place warm. Royce's hand stopped moving. The oiled rag fell from his numb fingers. He didn't turn. He stared into the fire, his jaw tightening until it ached. There was no woman. He lied, the words tasting like ash. He could feel her shifting on the cot. Yes, she said, her voice soft but certain. A man does not keep a rocking chair so close to the fire. A man does not have small soldiers on the wood above, or a doll with button eyes. Royce closed his own eyes. The ghosts, who had been silent watchers, stirred. He could almost hear Sarah humming as she rocked, the soft click of Samuel moving the wooden soldiers into battle lines, Mary's happy babble as she hugged the doll. The pain was a physical thing, a hot spike driving into his chest. "They are gone," he said, his voice a low, ragged growl. It was not an explanation. It was a command, an order to stop. But Kaya did not stop. She had the quiet persistence of a river wearing down a stone. "Gone where?" she asked. He picked up the rag and began rubbing the rifle stock with a furious energy. "It's not your concern. You loved them," she stated. It wasn't a question. It was a fact she had observed, as clearly as she had observed the chair and the toys. "Your face, it changes when you look at the chair. It becomes empty." "Be quiet," he snarled, turning to face her for the first time since nightfall. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes burning in the firelight. "You know nothing about me." She met his glare without flinching. Her dark eyes were pools of understanding, and he hated her for it. He wanted anger. He wanted fear. He did not want this quiet, knowing pity. "I know pain," she said simply. "I see it. It wears your shoulders like a heavy coat." He felt his defenses cracking, the careful walls of indifference crumbling under the gentle pressure of her words. He stood up, needing to move, to pace, to escape the intensity of her gaze. He strode to the other side of the small cabin, the floorboards groaning under his restless weight. He felt trapped, cornered. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. "I saved you. Isn't that enough?" "You saved my body," she replied, her voice steady. "But you hide from my eyes. You hide from everything." She paused, then asked the question that broke him open. "You do not want anyone to need you, do you?" The words hit him like a physical blow. He stopped pacing and leaned against the cold log wall, the rough bark digging into his back. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had seen the truth of him, the ugly, selfish core of his grief. After he had lost Sarah and the children, after he had failed to save them from the fever, he had sworn he would never be responsible for another living soul. He would never again feel the agony of that kind of loss. To be needed was to be vulnerable. To care was to invite devastation. He had built his entire existence around that one terrible principle. To be needed is to be weak, he finally managed to say, the words tasting like poison. No, she countered softly. To be needed is to be alive. You have forgotten. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh that held no humor. And what would you know about it? You're the one who was about to be wolf meat in a ravine. He expected her to recoil, to show hurt at his cruel words. Instead, her expression softened with something that looked like sorrow, but not for herself. I know what it is to be alone, she said. I know what it is to run, but I do not wish to die alone. You have chosen to live that way. He had no answer for that. He turned away from her again, facing the rough-hewn shelves where he kept his supplies. He rearranged a stack of tin plates that were already perfectly stacked. He was a coward. She was right. He was hiding. He was so terrified of the pain of the past that he was sacrificing any chance of a future. The cabin fell silent again. But this time the silence was different. It was no longer a weapon he used to keep her at a distance. It was a space filled with the truths she had just spoken, truths that hung in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. He heard the rustle of the mattress again, followed by a soft, pained sigh. He thought she had finally given up, that she would let him retreat back into his shell. He waited for the soft, even breathing of sleep. It didn't come. Minutes stretched into what felt like an hour. The fire crackled. The wind moaned. He could still feel her, a tense, alert presence in the corner of the room. He finally turned, his anger spent, leaving only a vast, hollow exhaustion. She was sitting up, her back against the wall. Her face was pale in the firelight, and her eyes were wide, fixed on the dark rectangle of the window. The shadows thrown by the fire danced on the walls, twisting into monstrous shapes. To her, they were not shadows. They were wolves. I cannot close my eyes, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I see them. I hear them. He felt a pang of something he refused to name. Pity, compassion. It was a dangerous feeling. They're gone, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. They won't come back here. They smelled the gunpowder. They smelled my scent. They'll keep their distance. My mind does not know that, she said, her gaze still locked on the window. My body, it remembers their teeth. She hugged her good arm to her chest. A small, protective gesture. He knew what she meant. He had his own ghosts, his own memories that came for him in the dead of night. He knew the terror of being unable to trust the silence. He was about to turn away, to tell her it wasn't his problem, to just get through the night. But she spoke again, and her words stopped him cold. I need you tonight, she said, finally turning her eyes from the window to look at him. Her gaze was direct, desperate, and held no trace of guile. Not in this bed, just there, where I can see you. I need to know someone else is here. I need you, just to sleep in peace. The request was so simple, so raw, so utterly devastating. She wasn't asking for his comfort, not in the way Sarah would have, seeking the circle of his arms. She was asking for a sentry. She was asking for the man who had faced down the wolves to stand guard against the shadows they had left behind. She was asking for his strength, not his affection. She was asking him to be what he had once been, a protector. And he couldn't do it. No, he said, the word coming out like a croak. Please, she whispered. The word was not a plea for mercy. It was a simple, unadorned statement of need. A need so profound it stripped away all pride. Royce felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. Every instinct, every rule he had lived by for 3 years, screamed at him to refuse, to walk to his own bed, turn his back, and let her fight her own demons. It was safer. It kept the walls intact. To agree was to acknowledge a bond, a duty that went beyond simple first aid. It was to admit that her peace of mind mattered to him. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the stark terror in her eyes, the exhaustion that pulled at her features, the stubborn pride that was warring with her desperate need for safety. And in that moment, she was not just an Apache woman, not just a stranger or an intrusion. She was a person, as real and as fragile as his own lost family, and she was asking for help. The man who had loved Sarah, the man who had told his children stories to chase away their night fears. That man was not entirely dead after all. He was buried deep, but he was not dead. With a long, shuddering sigh of defeat, Royce gave in. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Words were too complicated, too dangerous. Instead, he walked over to the stool he had been sitting on and dragged it to the center of the room. Halfway between the fire and her cot, he placed it directly in her line of sight. Then he picked up his Winchester, checked the chamber one last time, and sat down. He rested the rifle across his knees, facing the door, but turned so she could see his profile against the firelight. He did not look at her, but he felt her gaze on him. He felt the tension in the room slowly, almost imperceptibly, begin to ease. He heard a soft sigh, not of pain this time, but of release. The rustling from the cot ceased. He sat there, a silent guardian in the flickering dark. He was a prisoner of his own compassion. She had asked for his trust, or rather, she had offered him hers, and in doing so, had shackled him. This feeling, this quiet, terrifying responsibility for another person's peace, was more frightening than any wolf, more painful than any memory. It was the feeling of a heart, long frozen, beginning to thaw, and Royce Barrett knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the thawing was always the most painful part. Dawn broke pale and gray, filtering through the single grimy window of the cabin. Royce awoke with a start, not from a dream, but from the stiff, aching cold in his bones. He was still on the stool, the heavy Winchester lying across his lap. His neck was a knot of pain, and his legs were numb. Across the room, in the faint morning light, Kaya was awake. She was lying on her side, watching him. There was no fear in her eyes now, only a quiet, unnerving scrutiny. The fragile trust of the night had survived into the morning, and the realization settled in his gut like a cold stone. He pushed himself to his feet, his joints groaning in protest. The cabin felt smaller, the air thicker. His carefully constructed solitude had been irrevocably breached. He was no longer just a man living with ghosts. He was a man living with a woman, a responsibility he had not asked for and did not want. He moved about the morning chores with a brusque, deliberate silence. He rebuilt the fire, set a pot of coffee to boil, and sliced off thick strips of bacon to fry in a skillet. He was trying to reassert his control over the space, to fall back into the mindless rhythm of his existence. He was Royce Barrett, a man alone. This was his cabin. She was a temporary problem, like a leaky roof or a broken trap. She would be dealt with, and then she would be gone. He repeated this to himself like a prayer, but the words felt hollow. He took a cup of black coffee and a plate with bacon and a hard biscuit over to her. He set it on the floor beside the cot without a word and turned to leave. "You did not sleep," she said to his back. "Doesn't matter," he grunted, pouring his own coffee. "It does," she insisted. "A man who does not sleep cannot see the trail clearly. He cannot hear the snake in the grass." He took a long swallow of the scalding coffee, letting the bitterness jolt him awake. "I can see and hear just fine." He was lying. His mind felt fuzzy, his thoughts moving as slowly as molasses in winter. His exhaustion was not just from a lack of sleep. It was the weariness of a man forced to feel again after years of successful numbness. After their silent meal, he knew he had to check her wounds. He put it off for as long as he could, cleaning the skillet, sharpening his knife, even sweeping the dirt floor. Finally, there were no more tasks to hide behind. With a sigh of resignation, he refilled the basin with warm water and knelt beside her again. As he unwrapped the bandages, A tense silence fell between them. Her skin was warm to the touch, and the flesh around the stitches on her arm was red and angry-looking. But the telltale streaks of a festering wound were absent. His poultice on her legs seemed to be working. The swelling had gone down slightly. He worked with an impersonal efficiency, cleaning the wounds and applying a fresh dressing. "You need to tell me where your people are," he said, his voice flat as he tied off a new bandage. "When you're able to travel, I'll take you there." This was the solution. A simple, clean end to the problem. He would be the Good Samaritan, and then he would be alone again. He felt her stiffen under his touch. He looked up and saw that her expression had become guarded, the openness from the night before vanishing behind a shuttered mask. "My people are far," she said evasively. "How far?" he pressed. "A day's ride, too." She looked away from him, her gaze fixed on the far wall. "They are where I cannot return." Royce finished his work and sat back on his heels. A cold knot of apprehension began to form in his stomach. This was not the answer he wanted. What does that mean? Kaya was silent for a long time. He could see a struggle playing out across her face. She was weighing him, measuring him, trying to decide if the trust she had granted him in the dark could survive the harsh light of day. Finally, she seemed to come to a decision. She met his gaze, and her eyes were filled with a fierce, desperate gravity. "I ran," she said, her voice low but clear. "I left in the night. With only what I could carry, they will be looking for me." The cold knot in his stomach tightened. "Looking for you? Why did you steal something? Did you hurt someone?" A flicker of proud anger sparked in her eyes. "I stole only myself," she said. "My father, he is a practical man. He promised me to a warrior named Kale. It was an arrangement for horses, for influence." Royce felt a grim understanding dawn on him. He had seen this before among the settlers, and he knew the tribes had their own versions of it. A daughter traded like livestock for the benefit of a father. "Kale is a hard man," Kaya continued, her voice laced with a deep, quiet loathing. "He is a great hunter, a strong fighter, but his spirit is a stone. He breaks everything he touches, horses, dogs, people. He does not want a wife to share his fire. He wants another victory, another thing to own." She looked down at her own hands, clenching her good one into a fist. "My father believes this is a good match. He believes a strong hand will tame my spirit. He does not understand that my spirit is all I have. To tame it is to kill it." Royce stared at her, at the raw defiance in her face, and he thought of a wild mustang he had once seen, fighting against the rope, choosing to break its own neck rather than be broken by a man. He understood. "So you ran," he said, the words a simple statement of fact. "I ran," she confirmed. "For 3 days. I ran. I was making for the mountains, to the south. There are other bands there, people who might take me in. Then the wolves found me." The pieces clicked into place. The whole, terrible picture was now clear. He was not harboring a lost woman. He was harboring a fugitive. His cabin, his sanctuary from the world, had just become a hiding place. The men she spoke of, her father and this warrior Kale, they would not give up easily. An arrangement had been made. Honor was at stake. They would hunt for her as relentlessly as any wolf. A surge of anger, hot and sharp, coursed through him. It was an anger born of pure, animal fear. He was one man. His cabin was strong, but it was not a fortress. If they found her here, with him, they would not ask questions. A white man, alone in the mountains with their escaped woman. They would see a thief, a kidnapper. They would come with rifles and arrows. "You should have told me," he said, his voice a low growl. He stood up and walked away from her, needing to put distance between them. He felt betrayed. She had accepted his help, his protection, all while knowing she was bringing a war to his doorstep. "Would you have helped me if I had?" she challenged, her voice rising to meet his anger. Or would you have left me for the wolves, which death is better to be torn apart by teeth, or to be slowly suffocated in a cage you did not choose? He whirled on her, his fear making him cruel. That is not my concern. My life is my own. I have earned my peace here. You have no right to bring your troubles to my fire. I did not ask for your fire, she shot back, pushing herself up on her good arm, her eyes blazing. I asked only to not be eaten alive. You were the one who brought me here. You were the one who stitched my skin and sat guard in the dark. He had no answer for that. She was right. He had made the choice. Every step of the way, he had chosen to help her. And now he was trapped by those choices. He paced the length of the cabin, his mind racing. He could still fix this. He could wait for her to heal enough to walk, then give her some supplies and send her on her way. Point her south. Let her take her chances. It was her fight, not his. He would be washing his hands of it. It was the smart thing to do. It was the only thing to do if he wanted to survive. He stopped pacing and stood before the cold hearth, staring at the small wooden soldiers on the mantelpiece. Samuel's soldiers. A boy who would never grow up to be a warrior like Cale. A boy who would never have to fight for his freedom. He felt Kaya's eyes on him. He could feel her watching him, waiting for his judgment. He turned slowly and looked at her. The anger in her face had subsided, replaced by a weary, desperate plea. She knew, as well as he did, that her life was in his hands. If they find me, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, they will take me back. There will be shame, and then there will be the marriage. Cale will make sure I never run again. He will break my legs before he lets me go. My life, the one that is me, it will be over. I will be his property, until I die. He saw it then, the finality of it. This wasn't about a bad marriage. This was about the annihilation of a soul. And he, Royce Barrett, was being asked to stand between her and that annihilation. The cost of doing so could very well be his own life. The cost of not doing so. What was that cost? To live with the knowledge that he had sent her back to that fate, to be haunted by a ghost who was still breathing. He was a dead man walking, wasn't he? He had died 3 years ago with his family. What was he so afraid of losing, this empty shell of an existence, the company of his ghosts? His mind was a battlefield. His instinct for survival, honed by years of solitude, screamed at him to run, to cast her out, to save himself. But the man he used to be, the man who had loved and protected his family, that man looked at Kaya and saw not a problem, but a person fighting for the one thing he had thrown away, a life that mattered. He said nothing. He could not make a promise he might not be able to keep. He could not offer her hope when all he saw was danger. He turned his back on her again, a gesture of indecision, of profound, agonizing conflict. He heard her take a deep, shaky breath. She had one last arrow in her quiver. She loosed it, and it flew straight and true, aimed at the last, vulnerable part of his heart. "Royce," she said, her voice quiet but carrying across the small room. "If I were you, and you were me, would you abandon me?" The question hung in the air. Simple, direct, and absolutely unanswerable. It was a perfect trap. If he said yes, he would be admitting to a cold-hearted cruelty that would make him a monster in his own eyes. If he said no, he would be sealing his fate to hers, chaining himself to her fight, inviting the warriors and the war he so desperately feared. He stood frozen, his back to her, his hand resting on the cold stone of the fireplace. He could not speak. He could not move. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Outside, a hawk screamed, a lonely cry in the vast, indifferent sky. He couldn't answer her, and his silence was the most honest answer he could possibly give. It was the sound of a man's soul being torn in two. 4 days passed in a state of undeclared truce. Royce's silence was his answer, and Kaya seemed to understand it. She did not press him further. Instead, a quiet, domestic rhythm established itself in the small cabin, an unsettling parody of the life he had once known. He hunted. She tended the fire. He repaired a broken trap. She used his knife to carve a piece of scrap wood into the shape of a hawk, her hands surprisingly deft. He would find her watching him, her gaze thoughtful, and he would turn away, unnerved by the unspoken connection growing between them. Her body healed with the stubborn resilience of a wild thing. The redness on her arm faded, and she began to put weight on her injured leg. First with a crutch Royce fashioned from a sturdy branch, then without. Each step she took was a step closer to the inevitable. Soon, she would be able to travel. Soon, he would have to make a choice. He tried to tell himself the choice was simple, send her on her way. But the words felt like a lie every time they formed in his mind. He was no longer just her rescuer. He was her accomplice, her guardian. His silence had been a vow. It was on the morning of the 5th day that the world he had dreaded finally arrived. There was no warning shot, no war cry. There was only a sudden, electric tension in the air. His horse, tethered in the small, makeshift corral, gave a low, nervous whicker and stamped its feet. Royce was splitting firewood. The rhythmic thud of the axe a comfort, but he stopped mid-swing, his head snapping up. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet. The birds had stopped singing. The squirrels had ceased their chattering. It was a silence of held breath. He knew. He dropped the axe and moved swiftly, grabbing his Winchester from where it leaned against the cabin wall. He chambered around. The metallic schlick-schlack of the action, a sharp, definitive sound in the stillness. He opened the cabin door a crack and peered out. They were there, at the edge of the clearing, standing as silent and still as the pines they had emerged from. 4 Apache men. They were not painted for war, but they carried rifles, and their presence was a palpable threat. One was an older man with a face like a weathered map, his long gray hair braided with beads. Royce guessed this was her father. Another was younger, powerfully built, his face a mask of arrogant impatience. His eyes, black and hard as obsidian, scanned the cabin with a proprietary air. This had to be Cale. The other 2 were younger warriors, their expressions impassive, their hands never far from their weapons. Royce's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. This was it, the moment of reckoning. He stepped back inside, his face grim. Kaya was already on her feet, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a fear he had not seen since the day he'd found her. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Do not make a sound. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." He saw the protest in her eyes, the fierce spark of defiance. "Royce, do as I say," he snarled, his own fear making him harsh. He was not giving her a choice. This was his fight. He would stand between her and them. He stepped outside, pulling the heavy door shut behind him, and stood on the small porch, the rifle held loosely but ready in his hands. He was a barrier, a wall. He stood there, waiting. He let them see him, a big bearded white man with a rifle, standing his ground. He made no move, spoke no word. He let the silence stretch, forcing them to make the first move. Finally, the older man and Cale stepped forward. Walking into the clearing, they stopped about 20 paces from the cabin. "We are looking for a woman," the older man said, his English heavily accented but clear. "My daughter. Her name is Kaya." "Don't know her," Royce lied, his voice flat and hard. "No one here but me." Cale sneered, a contemptuous curl of his lip. "The tracks do not lie, white man. They lead here, to your door. She is inside." He took a step forward. Royce raised the barrel of the Winchester a few inches, a small, deadly movement. "This is my land," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Another step, and you'll be trespassing." Cale's hand tightened on the stock of his own rifle, his eyes flashing with fury. But the older man put a hand on his arm, a gesture of restraint. He looked at Royce, his gaze old and shrewd. "The girl was injured. We found the tracks of wolves and blood. If you have given her aid, we thank you, but she must return with us now. It is a matter of family, a matter of honor." "I found a woman in a ravine, half dead from a wolf attack," Royce admitted, changing his tactic. He would give them a partial truth. "I brought her here. She's in no condition to travel. Her leg is torn up bad. You try to move her now, she could lose it, or her life." Cale let out a harsh laugh. "She is strong. She will survive the journey. It is better than what will happen to you if you keep her." "Is that a threat?" Royce asked, his eyes narrowing. "It is a promise," Cale replied. The standoff was absolute, a fragile pane of glass that the slightest pressure would shatter into violence. Royce's mind raced. He could not win a fight against 4 armed men, but he would not back down. He would make them kill him to get past him. It was a stupid, pointless thought, but it was the only one he had. He would die here, on this patch of dirt, for a woman he barely knew. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. And then, the decision was taken out of his hands. The cabin door creaked open behind him. Royce's blood ran cold. "Kaya, no!" he growled without turning. "Get back inside." "I will not hide behind you," she said, her voice clear and steady. She stepped out onto the porch, moving with a pronounced limp but with her head held high. She did not lean on the wall for support. She stood on her own, her face pale but resolute. Royce wanted to scream at her, to shove her back inside and lock the door. He had tried to shield her, to take the danger upon himself, but with that one sentence, she had reclaimed her fight. Her father's stern expression faltered for a moment, a flicker of pained recognition in his eyes. Cale's face, however, hardened into a triumphant smirk. He saw a prize, cornered and ready for capture. "Kaya," her father said, his voice heavy with authority, "you have brought shame to our family. You will come home now." "This is not my home," Cale added, his voice possessive. "You will come to my fire, as was arranged." Royce started to speak, to tell them to back away from her, but Kaya put a hand on his arm. It was a small gesture, but it silenced him completely. Her touch was not a plea for protection. It was a command to stand down. This was her ground. She took a step forward, to the edge of the porch, so she was standing beside Royce, not behind him. She looked directly at her father. "Father," she said, her voice ringing with a strength Royce had never heard before. "I give you the respect you are due as the man who gave me life. But my life is not a horse to be traded. It is not a blanket to be given as a gift." She then turned her gaze on Cale, and her eyes turned to ice. "And you," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You speak of arrangements. You speak of your fire. You know nothing of me. You see only a reflection of your own pride. I would rather my spirit wander homeless in the mountains forever than to be warmed by a fire that would consume me." A stunned silence fell over the clearing. Cale's face contorted with rage, his arrogance pierced by the truth of her words. Her father looked down at the ground, a deep line creasing his brow. Royce stood beside her, his rifle forgotten in his hands. He was utterly transfixed. He was witnessing something profound. He had seen Kaya as a victim, a wounded creature he needed to protect. But the woman standing beside him now was no victim. She was a warrior. She was fighting not with a rifle or a knife, but with the unshakable power of her own will. Her limp, her torn dress, the lingering pallor of her face, they were not signs of weakness, but symbols of what she had endured to reach this moment. Then she delivered the final, devastating blow. She swept her gaze from Cale to her father, and then, for a brief, significant moment, to Royce. "I do not belong to you," she said, her voice resonating with the force of an oath. "I do not belong to Cale. I belong to no one, and I choose the person I want to stand beside." Her words hung in the air, a declaration of independence so absolute, so powerful, that no one dared to speak. In that moment, she was not just defending herself. She was redefining her entire world. She was not an object, a daughter, a prize. She was a woman, free and sovereign. And Royce felt as if he had been struck by lightning. In her courage, he saw the stark, ugly shape of his own cowardice. She, who had lost everything and faced death, was fighting for her life, for her right to choose. He, who had a cabin, a horse, his health, had willingly chosen a living death. He had surrendered to his grief, let it become his master. He had given up his own dignity, his own will, and hidden himself away. Kaya's words were not just for her father or for Cale. They were for him. I choose. The two most powerful words in the world. She had chosen to run. She had chosen to fight the wolves. And now, she was choosing to stand here, on his porch, and claim her own existence. He looked at her, and for the first time, he did not see a complication or a burden. He saw a person of immense strength, a spirit as untamed as the mountains themselves. He felt a surge of respect so profound it bordered on reverence, and mingled with that respect was a deep, burning shame for the man he had allowed himself to become. The long silence was finally broken by her father. He raised his head, and the anger was gone from his face, replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. He looked at his daughter, truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time not as a possession or a responsibility, but as the woman she had become. The arrangement is broken, he said, his voice heavy. He did not look at Cale. A spirit that will not be tamed cannot be gifted. You have chosen your path, my daughter, but you will walk it alone. You are no longer of my house. Father, Cale protested, stepping forward, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. Be silent, the old man commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. He turned a hard gaze on the furious warrior. She has spoken her heart. To force her now would be to take a slave, not a wife. There is no honor in that. He looked back at Kaya. One last time. Live your life then, he said, and turned his back. Cale stood frozen for a moment, his eyes locked on Kaya. The hatred in his gaze was a physical force, a promise of future vengeance. Then, with a guttural snarl of pure rage, he spun around and followed the old man back towards the trees. The other two warriors, their faces unreadable, faded back into the forest after them. In moments, they were gone. The clearing was empty. The birds, tentatively, began to sing again. The immediate danger had passed. Royce and Kaya were alone, the echoes of her words still hanging in the air between them. He slowly lowered the rifle, the tension draining out of him, leaving him weak and shaky. He looked at the woman beside him, the woman who had just faced down her past and won. She did not look triumphant. She looked exhausted and utterly alone. Her father had just disowned her. She had no home, no people, no protection but him. She turned her head and looked at him, and her eyes were filled with a terrible, beautiful vulnerability. He was no longer just a man who had saved a victim. He was the man she had chosen to stand beside. And he knew, with a certainty that both terrified and thrilled him, that he could no longer hide. Her courage demanded his. Her fight was now his fight, and for the first time in 3 long, empty years, Royce Barrett felt the stirrings of a life worth fighting for. The departure of her people left a vacuum in the clearing, a silence deeper and more unsettling than any that had come before. The threat was gone, but so was the world Kaya had known. She was in exile. Her father's final words, "You will walk it alone," echoed in the quiet air. But she was not alone. She was with him, and Royce felt the weight of that choice settle over him, a burden that was terrifying and, to his own astonishment, strangely welcome. They did not speak of what had happened. There were no words for it. Instead, they moved through the rest of the day in a shared, somber space. He watched her as she sat by the fire, her hands still, her gaze distant. He saw the tremor in her fingers, the profound sadness in her eyes. She had won her freedom, but the cost had been immense. He felt a fierce, protective ache in his chest, a feeling he had thought long dead and buried. He had spent 3 years guarding the tombs of his past. Now, he felt an undeniable urge to guard this woman's future. As dusk settled, he took the rocking chair, Sarah's chair, and moved it from its hallowed place by the hearth to the other side of the cabin. He then took a spare blanket and placed it on the chair. He did it without a word, then turned to stir the stew he was cooking for their supper. He did not look at her, but he felt her watch him, felt the weight of her unspoken question. It was a small gesture, but it was an earthquake. He was making room, not just in his cabin, but in his life. He was clearing a space for her among the ghosts. Night fell, black and starless. A heavy blanket of cloud had rolled in, smothering the moon. The wind had picked up, and it soughed through the pines with a restless, menacing voice. An oppressive tension filled the cabin. Royce had cleaned and loaded his rifle, and he kept it close, leaning against the table where he sat. He had also loaded the old Colt revolver he kept in his chest and tucked it into his belt. He did not believe for a moment that Cale would honor the elder's decision. A man like that, whose pride was his entire world, would see Kaya's defiance not as an act of courage, but as a personal insult that could only be washed away with violence. Kaya was quiet, but her stillness was not calm. It was the coiled stillness of a predator. She sat on the cot, watching the fire, but her ears were tuned to the night. Every creak of the cabin walls, every skittering sound on the roof, made her muscles tense. "He will come back," she said, her voice a low murmur that was almost lost in the sound of the wind. "I know," Royce replied. He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes scanning the dark rectangle of the window. "But he will not come openly, not now. He will come like a snake. He will try to burn us out," she said. "Fire is his way. It is loud and it is proud, and it destroys everything." Royce nodded grimly. She knew the man. He would have to trust her instincts. He banked the fire in the hearth, leaving only a bed of glowing embers. A large fire would make them a perfect target, silhouetted against the light. They sat in the near darkness, the only illumination coming from the faint orange glow of the coals. The ghosts were quiet tonight, pushed into the corners by the immediacy of the living threat. The hours crept by, one by one. The wind howled, a perfect cover for a creeping enemy. Royce felt his senses stretched taut, every nerve ending tingling. He was more alert, more alive, than he had been in years. The fog of his grief had been burned away by the sharp, clean focus of impending battle. It was the horse that gave them the first warning. A high, terrified scream ripped through the night from the small corral. It was a sound of pure agony and terror. Before the sound had even faded, Royce was on his feet, the Winchester in his hands. A horrifying orange light flickered against the window, casting dancing demonic shadows inside the cabin. "The stable," Kaya breathed, her voice tight with horror. Royce's gut clenched. His horse, his only link to the outside world, his partner in this lonely existence. Cale had gone for the heart. He was not just trying to get to Kaya. He was trying to cripple him, to strand him, to burn away his life piece by piece. He lunged for the door, but Kaya's hand shot out, grabbing his arm. "Wait! It is a trap. He wants you to run out, to save the horse." She was right. Of course she was right. His rage had nearly made him stupid. He stopped, his knuckles white on the stock of the rifle. He could hear the horse screaming again, a sound that was being flayed alive. From the darkness outside, a rifle shot cracked, and a bullet slammed into the heavy oak door, sending splinters flying inwards. They were pinned down. "Get away from the door," Royce grunted, pulling her with him towards the back of the cabin. Another shot followed, this one shattering the window pane. Glass rained down on the floor. "How many?" he asked, his voice low and urgent as he peered through a small crack in the log walls. "He would not come alone," she whispered, her face grim in the flickering, hellish light. "2, maybe 3 others. He is a coward. He needs a pack." The heat from the burning corral was becoming intense, the roar of the flames a constant, deafening backdrop to the fight. Royce could see figures moving in the shadows, dark shapes darting between the trees at the edge of the clearing. He raised his Winchester, sighted on one of the moving shadows, and fired. A cry of pain answered him, and one of the figures stumbled and fell back into the darkness. One down. But another shot came from a different direction. From the west, near the granite outcropping. They were circling, trying to get a clear shot through the window or the door. "This is not a fight," Royce muttered, reloading. "It's a siege. Then we must break it." Kaya said. Her fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard focus. This was her element. The hunted had become the hunter. "They think we are trapped. They think you are one man, a settler who only knows how to shoot from a window." She moved quickly to the hearth and grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet. It was a clumsy weapon, but in her hands, it looked deadly. "The back wall," she said, pointing. "There is a loose log. You showed me for airing the cabin in the summer." He had forgotten. A small section of the back wall, away from the fire, was a single, shorter log that could be removed to create a ventilation gap. It was small, barely big enough for a person to squeeze through, and it was cloaked in the deepest shadow. A plan, desperate and dangerous, began to form in his mind. "I need a distraction," he said. Kaya nodded, her eyes gleaming with a fierce intelligence. "I will give you one." Before he could protest, she darted to the table and grabbed the coal oil lamp. She lit the wick, turned it up high until the flame burned bright and yellow. And then, with a sharp cry, she hurled it through the broken window. The lamp shattered on the hard-packed dirt outside, and the oil exploded in a whoosh of bright yellow flame. For a few precious seconds, a wide circle of ground near the cabin was brilliantly illuminated. It was the perfect diversion. The shooters in the woods, their eyes accustomed to the dark, would be momentarily blinded, their attention drawn to the sudden burst of light. "Go!" she hissed. Royce didn't hesitate. He moved to the back wall, worked the log free, and squeezed through the narrow opening, the rough wood scraping his back. He emerged into the cold, smoke-filled night, the revolver now in his hand. He was in the deep shadow at the rear of the cabin, the roaring fire of the corral to his right, the burst of the lamp to his left. He crept along the wall, his moccasins making no sound on the soft earth. He heard the men shouting in confusion, drawn by the lamp. He rounded the corner of the cabin just in time to see one of Cale's men step into the faint light, his rifle raised, his back to Royce. Royce didn't think. He fired the Colt. The boom was deafening, and the man crumpled to the ground without a sound. "2 down!" A furious yell erupted from the trees. It was Cale. "He is outside. Find him!" Royce didn't wait. He melted back into the shadows, using the trees and rocks for cover, circling wide to come at them from the side. This was his forest. He knew every rock, every dip in the ground. They were on his territory now. He saw a muzzle flash from behind the granite outcropping and fired back instantly, the bullet screaming off the rock. He was no longer just defending. He was attacking. He was hunting, and in the midst of the chaos, a strange, fierce clarity came over him. He was not fighting for his horse, which he could now see had been freed from the corral and had bolted into the forest. He was not fighting for his cabin, which was just a collection of wood and memories. He was not even fighting for his own life, a life he had cared so little for just a few days ago. He thought of Kaya, alone in that cabin, armed with nothing but a skillet and her own incredible courage. She had trusted him. She had stood beside him. She had chosen him. Choosing her meant choosing this fight, and he was choosing it with every fiber of his being. The thought was a revelation, a hot, cleansing fire in his soul. For the first time since he had buried his family, he was not fighting to survive. He was fighting for someone. A figure broke from cover. Running for a better position, it was Cale, his silhouette unmistakable against the firelight. Royce raised the revolver, his hand steady, his aim true. He had a clear shot at Cale's chest. He could end this, right now. But a cold voice in his head, a voice that sounded remarkably like the man he used to be, stopped him. To kill him would be to start a blood feud that would never end. To wound him, to humiliate him, to drive him off. That was a victory. He lowered his aim and squeezed the trigger. Cale screamed, a high, sharp sound of pain and fury, and stumbled, clutching his shoulder. The rifle fell from his grasp. He stared into the darkness where Royce was hidden, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "This is not over, white man!" he shrieked. "She is mine!" Royce stepped out from behind the tree, the revolver held steady. "She belongs to no one," he said, his voice carrying clearly in a lull in the wind. "Now get off my land." For a moment, Cale looked as if he might charge, armed with nothing but his rage. But his remaining warrior was helping the first man Royce had shot to his feet, and they were already retreating. Cale looked at his wounded shoulder, then back at Royce, a look of venomous promise in his eyes. Then, clutching his arm, he turned and disappeared into the night, a defeated wolf slinking back into the shadows. Royce stood there for a long moment, the revolver heavy in his hand, his heart pounding in his ears. The roar of the fire was beginning to die down. The immediate battle was over. He turned and walked back to the cabin. Kaya was standing in the doorway, the skillet still in her hand. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes wide in the dying firelight. She looked at him, then at the smoking revolver, and then back to his face. She searched his eyes, and what she saw there made her own soften. He walked up the steps and stopped in front of her. The air between them was electric, thick with unspoken things. He had fought for his ghosts for 3 years. Tonight, he had fought for her, and in doing so, he had finally, truly, come back to life. He was no longer a man hiding from his past. He was a man with a future to defend. The world shrank to the small patch of ground between them, illuminated by the dying glow of the burned corral. The roaring beast of the fire had devoured itself, leaving behind a bed of angry red embers that pulsed in the darkness like a giant, fading heart. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt pine and ash, a scent of violence and survival. Royce stood on the porch steps, the heavy Colt still warm in his hand, its weight a strange and terrible comfort. Kaya stood in the doorway, the skillet held loosely at her side, her knuckles white. They were both breathing hard, the adrenaline of the fight slowly draining away, leaving a hollow, trembling exhaustion in its wake. They had won. They were alive. But the victory felt less like a triumph and more like a profound and irreversible shift in the landscape of their lives. The clearing was scarred, his horse was gone, and the future was a dark, unknown forest. He finally broke the silence, his voice a low, rough rasp. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, her gaze never leaving his face. She was looking at him in a way she never had before. The watchfulness was still there, but it was different now. It was softer, stripped of its defensive edge. She was not assessing a stranger. She was seeing a partner. He holstered the revolver, the motion feeling final, like closing a book. He walked past her into the cabin, needing to move, to do something with the restless, surging energy still coursing through his veins. The inside of the cabin was a mess of shattered glass and splintered wood. He righted the stool she had used as a shield and began to pick up the larger shards of glass from the floor, his hands moving with a mechanical steadiness he did not feel. Kaya followed him inside and closed the door, shutting out the smoking ruins of the night. She didn't help him clean. She simply stood and watched him, letting the silence build again. But this time it was not a silence of tension or uncertainty. It was a silence of waiting, of contemplation. When he had cleared the worst of the glass, he straightened up and turned to face her. In the dim light from the hearth's embers, he could see the smudge of soot on her cheek, the exhaustion that shadowed her eyes. He saw the slight tremor in her hands. He had an overwhelming urge to reach out, to wipe the soot from her face, to steady her hands with his own. But he stood rooted to the spot, a chasm of unspoken things still between them. He had fought for her, but he did not know what that meant. He did not know who they were to each other now. It was she who finally bridged the gap. She took a step towards him, her limp more pronounced in her weariness. She stopped just out of arm's reach. "You fought for me," she said. It was not a question or an expression of gratitude. It was a simple, profound statement of fact. "They were burning my home," he countered, the defensive words tasting like a lie even as he said them. "They were burning a stable," she corrected him gently. "They shot at a house. You fought for me." He had no answer for the truth in her eyes. He could only nod, a single, sharp movement of his head. She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she said the words that changed everything. "You do not keep me here, Royce. You did not win me in a fight. I am not your property, any more than I was Cale's." Her words were a sharp, clean cut, severing any notion of debt or obligation. She was asserting her freedom, not just from her past, but from him. He felt a strange, sharp pang of something that felt like loss. He had found a purpose in protecting her, and now she was reminding him that she did not need a keeper. But then she continued, her voice soft but unshakable. "I am not a prisoner of your kindness. I am not bound to you by gratitude." She took another small, deliberate step, closing the distance between them until only a breath of air separated them. "I choose to stay." The simple declaration landed with the force of a physical blow. I choose to stay. It was not a plea. It was not a surrender. It was a gift, freely and consciously given. It was an act of profound trust from a woman who had every reason to trust no one. She was choosing this broken man, this haunted cabin, this dangerous, uncertain life. She was choosing him. He felt the carefully constructed dam around his heart, which had been cracking for days, finally shatter. A flood of emotion, grief, gratitude, a terrifying, soaring hope surged through him, leaving him speechless. He could only stare at her, the truth of her words reflected in the dark, steady pools of her eyes. He finally found his voice, but it was thick, choked with 3 years of unshed tears. "Why?" he whispered. The question was a raw, naked thing. Why would she choose this? Why would she choose him? She did not answer with words. Instead, she slowly raised her uninjured hand and gently, tentatively, touched his face. Her fingers were cool against his rough, bearded cheek. Her touch was not one of passion, but of quiet, profound recognition. It was a touch that said, "I see you." And at her touch, the last of his resistance crumbled. The ghosts of Sarah and the children, who had been a constant, accusing presence in his life, seemed to recede, to grow quiet. It was as if their silent vigil was finally over. The man they had loved was no longer lost. "Kaya," he breathed, his voice breaking. "From the moment you put your hand on my arm, out there on the porch, when you stood beside me, I knew." He shook his head, struggling to articulate the immense, terrifying shift that had occurred within him. "For 3 years, I have been a stone. I have been a memory. I welcomed the silence because I did not want to hear another living voice. I did not want to feel anything. It was safer to be dead." He looked into her eyes, letting her see all the broken pieces of his soul. "But when you stood with me, when you chose to face them at my side, I did not want to be alone anymore. The silence, it became empty. Not peaceful, just empty. I wanted to hear your voice when the fight was over. A single tear traced a path through the soot on her cheek. She did not wipe it away. And I, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, wanted to see your face. The space between them was no longer a chasm. It was a sacred ground, a place where two broken souls had found a mirror in each other. He saw his own pain, his own loneliness, his own fierce will to survive reflected in her, and in him, she saw a man capable of a gentleness and a ferocity she had never known, a man who had faced down his own demons to stand guard over hers. They needed each other. It was a truth as raw and as real as the splintered wood on the floor and the smoking ruins outside. It was not a weakness. It was a fundamental human need, a need he had denied for 1,000 empty days and nights. They needed each other to heal. They needed each other to be whole. They needed each other to truly live. He slowly, reverently, covered her hand with his own, pressing her palm against his cheek. He felt the steady beat of her pulse against his skin. It was the rhythm of life, of hope. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. Their first kiss was not a clash of passion or a surge of desire. It was as gentle and as quiet as a prayer. It was a soft, hesitant meeting of lips, a sharing of breath in the dim, quiet cabin. It was a kiss of profound and solemn understanding. It tasted of wood smoke and sorrow, of gunpowder and a fierce, unyielding hope. It was the sealing of an unspoken pact, a promise made not with words, but with the simple, undeniable truth of their shared existence. In that kiss, he was not betraying the memory of his wife. He was honoring her by choosing to live again, and Kaya was not surrendering her freedom. She was exercising it in the most powerful way possible, by choosing to anchor her life to another's. They stood there for a long time, locked in that gentle embrace, two survivors in the heart of the vast, indifferent wilderness. The fire in the corral had died, leaving only the cold darkness of the night, but inside the cabin, in the space between two hearts that had chosen each other, a new fire had just been lit, and they both knew, with a certainty that settled deep in their bones, that this was a flame they would protect with their lives. The peace that followed the attack was a fragile, wounded thing. It was the quiet of a forest after a fire, the silence of a held breath. They knew Cale's humiliation was a festering wound, and men like him did not heal from such injuries. They sought only to inflict them on others. The question was not if he would return, but when and how. This shared knowledge became the new foundation of their life. Their days were no longer measured by sunrises and sunsets, but by a constant, simmering state of preparation. The cabin, once Royce's tomb of solitude, became a fortress. He and Kaya worked from dawn till dusk, a silent, efficient team bound by a purpose that transcended words. He used his axe not just to split firewood, but to fell young, slender pines, sharpening their ends into wicked points which he set in the ground in a wide, hidden perimeter around the clearing. He reinforced the door with an iron strap from his forge and barred it at night with a heavy log. He carefully chiseled 2 new loopholes into the walls, one facing east and one north, just wide enough for a rifle barrel, giving them a clear field of fire in all directions. While he worked with wood and iron, Kaya worked with the forest. She moved through the trees like a ghost, her bare feet seeming to read the earth. She taught him things he had never known. Despite his years in the wild, she showed him how a bent branch could signal the passage of a man, how a disturbed stone could tell a story. Together, they rigged a series of snares, not to catch game, but to act as an early warning system thin. Taut gut lines tied to a collection of deer hooves that would rattle if disturbed. She found a hidden spring and cleared the path to it, ensuring they would have water even if besieged. She gathered herbs not just for healing, but for making smoke that would irritate the eyes and lungs. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, not in silence, but in a state of quiet communication. She would weave cordage from plant fibers, and he would melt lead to cast new bullets. He would watch her hands, strong and sure, and feel a sense of peace that was deeper and more real than the empty tranquility he had known before. She had brought the world back to his door, a world of danger and blood. But she had also brought life. She had filled the empty spaces in his cabin and in his heart. The rocking chair was hers now, and the sight of her sitting there, her face serene in the firelight, was a pain and a beauty so profound it made his chest ache. 10 days after the first attack, it happened. The sun was not yet a rumor in the east. The world was a wash of gray and deep purple. It was the hour of ghosts, the coldest and quietest time of the night. Royce was dozing lightly on his cot, the Winchester by his side, when a faint, dry rattle came from the woods to the north. It was the sound of a deer hoof striking another. It was their alarm. Instantly, he was awake, his heart leaping into a hard, steady rhythm. He looked across the room. Kaya was already sitting up in the rocking chair where she'd fallen asleep, her eyes wide and alert in the gloom. She held a bow in her hand, one she had crafted herself over the past week from a seasoned piece of hickory, its string taut and new. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They had rehearsed this. Royce moved to the northern loophole while Kaya went to the one facing east. He peered into the pre-dawn darkness. He could see nothing, but he could feel them, a ripple of wrongness in the natural order of the forest. An arrow thudded into the log wall just beside his head, a venomous whisper of what was to come. Then another, and another, a volley. They were testing the defenses, trying to draw their fire. Royce held his position, his breathing low and even. He would not give them a target. Then he saw a flicker of orange. An arrow with a burning, pitch-soaked rag tied to its head soared in a high arc and landed on the sod roof. Another followed. Kaya's warning from their first night echoed in his mind. He will try to burn us out. The roof, he said, his voice a low growl. The water is ready, she replied, her voice calm and steady. They had anticipated this. 2 large barrels of water stood inside, and they had rigged a simple bucket pulley. As more flaming arrows landed, small patches of the dry sod began to smolder and smoke. While Kaya kept watch, Royce worked the pulley, dousing the flames before they could take hold. It was a desperate, exhausting dance, and he knew it was exactly what Cale wanted for them to be occupied, distracted. They are splitting up, Kaya whispered from her post. I see 2 moving to the west. Cale is staying to the east with 2 others. 5 of them. This was not a raid, it was an invasion. I have to get outside, Royce said. We can't win a siege. He will be watching the back, she warned. He is not a fool twice. I'm not going out the back. His own plan was a desperate gamble. In the center of the floor was a loose puncheon he had prepared, leading to the shallow crawl space beneath the cabin. It was a tight fit, and it would leave him vulnerable. But it was their only chance. Keep their attention, he said. Fire a shot to the east in 1 minute. Make them think you're still looking that way. She nodded once, her eyes dark with a trust that was both his strength and his greatest fear. He prized the floorboard loose, took the Colt revolver and a knife, and slid into the cold, musty darkness under the cabin. The earth was damp and smelled of decay. He crawled on his belly towards the far side of the cabin, the sounds of the battle above muffled and strange. He heard the sharp crack of Kaya's bow, followed by an angry shout from outside. She was drawing their fire. He emerged from under the cabin into a thicket of overgrown bushes. 100 yards from the main clearing, he was a ghost in the woods. He moved silently, circling wide to the west, towards the 2 men Kaya had spotted. He found them setting up a crossfire position, preparing to pepper the cabin from a new angle. They were focused on the loopholes, on the woman they thought was trapped inside. They never saw him coming. He moved like a shadow, and the fight was brutal and short. He used the knife, not the gun. Sound was the enemy. He left them where they fell and continued his circle, his heart pounding with a cold, clear purpose. He found their horses tethered in a small, hidden copse. This was the key. He cut two of the tethers, slapped the horses hard on their rumps, and sent them stampeding through the undergrowth, directly towards the area where he knew Kaya had laid a trap. He heard shouts of alarm and anger from Cale's position. Two men, their silhouettes stark against the growing light of dawn, broke from cover and ran to intercept their fleeing mounts. They ran straight into a nearly invisible rope of woven gut, stretched taut a foot off the ground between two thick pines. The lead man went down hard with a strangled cry, his leg twisting at an unnatural angle. The second man tripped over him, his rifle flying from his hands. Royce did not give them a chance to recover. He fired the Colt twice, the booms echoing through the forest like thunderclaps. Now it was just Cale. Royce reloaded the revolver and began to stalk back towards the clearing. He was the hunter now, and his blood was up. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. He moved with a confidence he hadn't felt in years, the forest his ally, his instincts sharp and clear. He saw Cale hunkered down behind a large boulder, firing methodically at the cabin. The warrior was so consumed with his target, so obsessed with the woman inside, that he had become deaf and blind to the predator circling him. Royce raised the Colt, lining up the shot. But Cale was a warrior for a reason. Some sixth sense, some animal instinct, made him turn. His eyes widened in shock and rage as he saw Royce. He abandoned the cabin and charged, not with his rifle, but with a long, heavy knife in his hand, letting out a furious war cry. Royce fired, but Cale was moving fast, weaving like a striking snake. The bullet clipped his arm, but it didn't stop him. He crashed into Royce, and they both went down in a tangle of limbs. The Colt was knocked from Royce's hand, skittering away into the dirt. They rolled over and over, a desperate, grunting struggle of muscle and will. Cale was a whirlwind of fury, his knife flashing. Royce blocked a strike that would have disemboweled him, the blade slicing a deep gash in his forearm. Pain, hot and blinding, shot up his arm. Cale pressed his advantage, his weight pinning Royce down. He raised the knife for a final, killing blow, his face a mask of triumphant hatred. "She is mine," he snarled, his spittle hitting Royce's face. Suddenly, a sound like a hornet's buzz cut through the air, and Cale grunted, a look of shocked surprise on his face. He stiffened, and an arrow shaft sprouted from the thick muscle of his shoulder, the same shoulder Royce had shot before. He looked up towards the cabin. Kaya was standing in the doorway, her bow raised, another arrow already knocked on the string. Her face was as calm and as deadly as a winter storm. The momentary distraction was all Royce needed. He bucked hard, throwing the wounded Cale off him. He scrambled for his revolver, but Cale was faster. Ignoring the arrow in his shoulder, he lunged for the cabin, for the woman who had defied and now wounded him. "Kaya!" Royce yelled, trying to get to his feet, his wounded arm screaming in protest. Cale burst into the cabin. He saw only his prize, the woman he had come to claim. He staggered towards her, his knife held out. Kaya did not retreat. She stood her ground, her eyes locked on his. She let him get closer, let his arrogance and his rage consume him. When he was only a few feet away, she drew the bowstring to her cheek and released. The arrow took him in the thigh of his good leg. It was not a killing shot. It was a crippling one. He roared in pain and collapsed to his knees, his knife clattering to the floor. He looked up at her, his face a mixture of agony and disbelief. He had been brought down, not by the white man, not by another warrior, but by her, the ultimate humiliation. She stepped forward, picking up his fallen knife. She walked until she stood over him, a figure of implacable judgment. He was a defeated, bleeding man at her feet. Royce limped to the doorway, his own pain forgotten, and watched, transfixed. Cale looked up at her, his voice a venomous hiss. "You will die for this." Kaya looked down at him, and there was no fear in her eyes. There was no hatred, There was only a vast, cold contempt. She held his knife in her hand, and for a moment, Royce thought she might end it. Instead, she knelt and laid the flat of the blade against the taut string of his bow, which lay on the floor beside him. With a sharp, sudden movement, she sawed through the string, severing it. She then tossed the useless knife into a dark corner of the cabin. She had taken his weapon, his strength, his very identity as a warrior, and discarded it like trash. She stood up and looked down at the kneeling, defeated man. "I do not belong to you," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with the finality of a death sentence. "I never have, and I never will." She turned her back on him, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and walked to Royce's side. "Let's fix that arm," she said, as if she were merely commenting on the weather. Cale stared at her back, his mouth agape. He had been defeated not by death, but by a power he could not comprehend, a woman's will to be free. With a guttural sound that was half sob, half curse, he struggled to his feet and staggered out of the cabin, a broken man disappearing back into the forest that had rejected him. The scars on the land healed first. Winter came and buried the ashes of the corral under a deep, cleansing blanket of snow. The world went quiet, wrapped in a cold, peaceful slumber. And when the thaw came, spring arrived with a gentle, determined persistence, pushing new green life up through the wounded earth. The seasons turned, and with them, the lives of the two people in the small cabin in the high country. 6 months after the night of fire and blood, the clearing was almost unrecognizable. The cabin was no longer a cramped, solitary box, a new room built of fresh-hewn pine logs that still smelled of sap, extended from the western wall. The rhythmic thud of Royce's axe and the steady rasp of his saw had been the music of their winter. He was not just adding a room. He was building a future, creating space for a life he had never thought he would have again. The new room had a wide window that faced south, letting in the warm sun, and the ghosts of the past no longer felt so crowded. Where the burned corral had stood, there was now a garden. Kaya had worked the soil with her bare hands, turning the ash and earth into a place of life. Neat rows of corn, beans, and squash. The 3 sisters of her people now stood green and vibrant under the sun. She had a patch of wild herbs she had transplanted from the forest, their scents mingling with the smell of the pines. To see her kneeling in the dirt, her dark hair falling over her shoulders as she tended her plants, was to see a woman putting down roots. Royce's horse, a tough, rangy buckskin he called Pilgrim, had returned a few days after the fight, drawn back by habit and the memory of oats. And they had acquired another. A gentle mare Royce had traded for with a passing trapper, paying with a stack of prime beaver pelts. Now, 2 horses grazed peacefully in a newly built, stronger corral. Kaya had a gift with them. She spoke to them not with commands, but with a quiet language of touch and breath, and they responded with a deep, trusting calm. The changes on the outside were merely a reflection of the changes within. The most profound transformation happened in the quiet moments, in the space between the turning of the days. Royce woke each morning to the sight of Kaya sleeping beside him in the wide bed he had built to fill the new room. He would lie there in the gray light of dawn and watch the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders, the way a lock of her black hair fell across her cheek. The first time he had woken up beside her, a jolt of panic and guilt had shot through him. But now, it was simply peace. He had learned that a heart was not a house with only one room. His love for Sarah and the children was a room he could visit whenever he wished, a place of quiet, gentle memory, no longer a tomb of agonizing grief. Kaya had not replaced them. She had simply built a new room alongside theirs, a place of warmth and light and living breath. He could love her, deeply and completely, without betraying them. In fact, he felt he was honoring them by choosing to live, by choosing to embrace the gift of a second chance. They had learned to speak a new language, one made of shared glances, small touches, and long, comfortable silences. But they had also learned to use words again, to share the stories that had shaped them. In the long winter evenings, sitting by the fire, they had slowly, carefully, unspooled the threads of their pasts. He had been the first to speak. One night, as the snow fell softly outside, he had picked up one of Samuel's small wooden soldiers from the mantelpiece. He had held it in his palm, his thumb rubbing over the worn, painted wood. His name was Samuel, he had said, his voice quiet. He was 6. He had his mother's laugh. He had looked at Kaya, and her dark eyes were filled with a deep, patient compassion. She did not speak, did not push. She simply waited, giving him the space to continue. And Mary, she was 4. She loved the color of the sky in the morning. He had finally told her about the fever, about his helplessness, about the 3 small graves he had dug on the hill behind the cabin. He had spoken without the ragged, tearing grief of before, but with a clean, aching sadness. He was not showing her a wound. He was sharing a scar. She had listened, and when he was done, she had reached out and taken his hand, her fingers lacing through his. She had not offered empty words of comfort. She had simply shared his silence. And later that night, she had shared a piece of her own story. She spoke of her mother, a weaver of beautiful blankets, who had taught her the names of the stars. She spoke of the freedom of riding her pony across the open plains as a child, the wind in her hair, feeling as if she could outrun the sun itself. She spoke of her own dreams, of a life that was her own, a life that Cale's possessive pride would have crushed. They were learning to love again, not with the fiery, untested passion of youth, but with the quiet, steady strength of 2 people who knew the true cost of loss. Their love was a slow-growing, deep-rooted thing, nurtured in the soil of mutual respect and shared survival. It was in the way he brought her a cup of coffee in the morning, just the way she liked it. It was in the way she would mend a tear in his shirt without being asked. It was in the way they worked together, their bodies moving in an easy, familiar rhythm, a silent dance of partnership. One bright afternoon, they were working with the new mare. She was skittish, still wary of her new surroundings. Royce held her lead rope while Kaya approached her slowly, murmuring in a low, soft voice, her hand held out. "She is afraid of being trapped," Kaya said, her eyes on the horse. But Royce knew she was speaking of more than just the mare. "She needs to know the rope is not a cage, that it is a connection." She gently stroked the mare's neck, her touch calming the animal's trembling. "You see," she said, looking at Royce over the horse's back, a small, knowing smile on her face. "Trust is not built with force. It is offered, and it must be accepted." Royce felt the truth of her words settle deep inside him. He had been a man trapped by his own grief. Kaya had not forced him out of his cage. She had simply stood beside it, offering a connection, until he had been brave enough to accept it. But their peace, as deep and as real as it was not a naive one. It was a peace that was earned, and a peace that had to be guarded. The world had not changed. Cale was still out there somewhere, a venomous snake nursing its wounded pride. Other dangers outlaws, speculators. The simple, brutal indifference of nature were a constant presence just beyond the edge of their clearing. They knew this. It was an unspoken truth that lived between them. It was in the way Royce still cleaned his Winchester every evening, his hands moving with a familiar, deadly efficiency. It was in the way Kaya still practiced with her bow, her arrows thudding into a target on a pine tree with a quiet, lethal accuracy. Their home was a place of love and warmth, but it was also a bastion. Their garden was a place of life, but the sharpened stakes that surrounded it were a reminder of the ever-present threat of death. They did not speak of fear. They did not dwell on what might come. They simply prepared. They were 2 warriors who had found their own small patch of ground worth defending. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in strokes of fiery orange and deep purple, they stood on the porch of their new home. Royce's arm was around her shoulders, and her head rested against his chest. They looked out at the life they had built together. The neat rows of the garden, the sturdy corral, the cabin that was no longer a place of sorrow, but a place of refuge. "It's quiet," Royce said, his voice a low rumble. "It is peaceful," Kaya replied, looking up at him. "But peace is not the absence of danger. It is the absence of fear." He looked down at her, at the woman who had faced down wolves and warriors, who had lost her home and her people, but had never lost herself, the woman who had taught him how to live again. He knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the mountains around them, that Kale could come back. The world could throw its worst at them, but they would face it, together. They were not hiding anymore. They were not running. They were home. The first snow of the season was falling. Not a blizzard, but a gentle, hushed descent of white flakes that drifted down from a pearl-gray sky. They clung to the dark branches of the pines and softened the hard edges of the world, wrapping the small cabin in a profound and peaceful silence. Inside, the fire in the hearth crackled and popped, a warm, living heart in the center of their home. The air smelled of wood smoke, brewing coffee, and the rich, savory scent of a rabbit stew simmering in the pot. Royce sat at the table he had built, carefully honing the edge of his hunting knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic shk, shk, shk of steel on stone was a comforting, familiar sound. He was no longer a man performing tasks to keep the ghosts at bay. He was a man tending to the tools of his life, a life that was full and real. His gaze drifted across the room to where Kaya sat in the rocking chair, her feet tucked beneath her. A soft buckskin shirt he had recently finished sewing for her draped over her shoulders. She was mending one of his shirts, her needle moving with a quick, sure rhythm, her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched the firelight play on her high cheekbones and catch in the dark, shining river of her hair. A feeling of such deep, quiet contentment washed over him that it was almost painful. It was a feeling he had never expected to have again. He had thought that part of his life was over, a book closed and buried with his family. But Kaya had not just started a new chapter. She had convinced him to begin a whole new volume. He remembered the man he had been, a hollow shell haunted by the echoes of a life that was gone. He had walked through his days like a ghost, his only purpose to endure until the end. And now he looked forward to the mornings. He found joy in the simple weight of a well-balanced axe, in the taste of the bread Kaya baked, in the shared warmth of their bed on a cold night. She had not erased his past or his pain. She had simply shown him that his life was bigger than his grief. She must have felt his gaze, because she paused in her sewing and looked up, her dark eyes meeting his across the room. She held his look for a long moment, and in her eyes he saw a reflection of his own contentment, but also something else, something deeper and more thoughtful. She set the shirt aside in her lap and leaned her head back against the chair, her gaze drifting to the dancing flames. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackling of the fire and the soft whisper of the snow against the window pane. "Royce," she said, her voice soft, almost a part of the fire's gentle song. "Do you ever regret it?" He stopped his work, the knife and stone held motionless in his hands. "Regret what?" he asked, though he knew what she meant. "This," she said, with a small, graceful gesture that took in the whole cabin, the new room, the life they had built, me, choosing to fight for me. Your life was quiet before. You had your peace." He looked at her, at the earnest, searching expression on her face. She was not asking out of insecurity. She was asking as a partner, as someone who understood the true weight of the choices they had made. She knew what his life had been, the solitude he had so fiercely guarded. He put the knife and stone down on the table and leaned forward, his elbows on the rough-hewn wood. He thought of his answer, not because he was unsure, but because he wanted to give her the truest words he possessed. A slow, genuine smile touched his lips. a smile that reached his eyes and crinkled the weathered skin at their corners. It was a smile she had given back to him. "Kaya," he said, his voice low and certain. "The only thing I regret is that it took me 33 years to find you. I only regret that I didn't hear you screaming in that ravine sooner." Her breath hitched, and a luminous sheen of tears welled in her eyes, but they did not fall. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her own face, a smile that lit up the entire room. He stood up and walked over to her, kneeling on the warm hearthstones in front of her chair. He took her hands in his, the one holding the needle and the other resting on the worn fabric of his shirt. Her hands were strong and capable, but they felt small and delicate in his. "Before you," he continued, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I wasn't living in peace. I was living in a quiet grave I had dug for myself. I was just waiting for the dirt to be shoveled on top. I thought that was strength, to feel nothing, to need no one." He looked around the cabin, at the signs of their shared life. Her bow hanging on the wall beside his rifle, her clay pot sitting on a shelf next to his tin plates, her moccasins drying by the fire. "You came here, and you didn't just fight wolves and warriors. You fought my ghosts. You fought the silence. You showed me that this—" He squeezed her hands. "This is what living is. Sharing a fire, mending a shirt, waking up in the morning and knowing you are not alone." She leaned forward and touched his cheek, her thumb gently tracing the line of his jaw. "And you," she whispered. "You showed me what it is to be chosen, not taken or bartered for, or won, but seen and chosen." She looked him in the eye, and her voice was firm, a soft and unbreakable vow. "You are mine, Royce Barrett." He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a moment as he absorbed the truth of her words. He remembered the first time she had said something like that, a desperate, defiant claim in the bloody ravine. Now, the words held a completely different meaning. It was not a claim of possession, but a statement of belonging. A circle, completed. "And I am yours, Kaya," he replied, his voice a low oath, "now and always." He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was deep and slow and full of all the words they did not need to say. It was a kiss of gratitude, of promise, of a love that had been forged in fire and tempered into something stronger than steel. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling and sitting by the fire as the snow fell outside, blanketing the world in white. Two people, once shattered by their pasts, holding each other in the present, their hearts fixed on a shared future. He wrapped his arms around her, and she leaned into his embrace, her head finding its familiar place on his shoulder. He held her, the solid, living warmth of her a constant, beautiful miracle, and in the quiet peace of his home, with the woman he loved in his arms. Royce Barrett finally understood the great, terrifying, and wonderful truth he had spent 3 long years running from. The most frightening thing in the world wasn't losing someone you loved. The most frightening thing was going through your whole life and never giving yourself the chance to love at all. Thank you for listening to this story. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story be heard by more people, please consider supporting us by hitting the hype button.